So the last couple of nights we've had a lot of information with a lot of slides, and I have good news and I have bad news for you. Starting tomorrow night, the next 3 lessons are going to be shorter and simpler and not so many charts, and will be more in the text. The bad news is that's starting tomorrow night. Tonight, there's a good bit of data we're going to look at, but I think that you'll find it interesting and valuable. And so I'll try to go through it not too quickly, but keep moving so we don't go too long. And I want to say this before we begin. I'm not saying or suggesting that we need to know the date and the authorship of every person, every book of the Bible, because we don't. For instance, I don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, and I don't know what year it was written. Looks like it was before the temple was destroyed, but don't know when. I don't know who wrote the book of Job. I don't know when it was written. But because there are so many attacks on the Gospels and the story of Jesus Christ, and we talked about this on Sunday night, and the idea that all of things are later, I think it's helpful to be able to isolate where we can and find the historical arguments for, in this case, I'm going to be proposing what I believe is the case about the authorship of Luke and Acts. We mentioned before that none of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, have the name of the author given as the name or a date given that this is the year that it was written. But I'll be presenting a case for date and authorship of Luke, Acts, and let's just go ahead and get right into that. So 3 notes I want to make at the beginning on the significance of the Luke Acts text. Number 1, who of the following wrote the largest percentage of your New Testament? Was it Peter, Paul, John, or Luke? You might be thinking, well, surely it was Paul. Then you might think, well, John wrote a lot of books and you got 2 long ones. Actually, the author who wrote more of the New Testament than anybody else is Luke. Over a fourth of the New Testament is written by Luke, Luke Acts. Secondly, without the book of Acts, we would have the Gospels and the epistles. So you would have a Jewish Messiah picking out 12 apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, John, etc., and then a bunch of letters from a Pharisee named Paul. And there's some allusions to it, but you wouldn't know everything, and Gentiles, and so it's a real bridge building thing, and it gives us the accounts of Saul's conversion. We made reference on Sunday. To me, one of the powerful factors in looking at evidence is the conversion of Saul. And I was studying with a fellow one time who was losing his faith, and when I talked about the things in Acts, he said, well, but Luke didn't write that, and it was written later, so he wasn't trusting in that. Well, I'm going to be making a case, yes, Luke did write it. He was a close associate of Paul, knew Paul very well, and he's relating things that Paul makes reference to as well. Thirdly, it's a volume 1, volume 2 work, and the first is a proclamation of the gospel, and the second is the proclamation of that gospel out among the lost. And so it's a really good set of texts for evangelism. Lots of times when I study with somebody, one of the things I like to study with them is the Gospel of Luke. And then if you want to see how it spread and the reaction to the resurrection and it being taken to lost and how people became Christians, right into the book of Acts. So it's a really, really important text. But if you say to your friend, hey, let's study, and let's study Luke and Acts, and he says, okay, but he decides to Google Luke or Acts before your study, here's what he's going to read from Wikipedia. The Gospel of Luke, Acts, and the Gospel of Luke and Acts of Apostles make up 2-volume work. Together, they account for 27.5% of the New Testament, largest contribution by a single author. The author is not named. According to a church tradition dating from the 2nd century, who was Luke, named as a companion of Paul. That's true. And then he's going to keep reading, And it's going to say, but a critical consensus emphasizes the countless contradictions between the account in Acts and the authentic Pauline letters. An example can be seen by comparing Acts accounts of Paul's conversion with Paul's own statement that he remained unknown to Christians in Judea. And so they're saying it's not really by Luke. And then they'll say, since scholars have decided that Luke didn't do it, now almost nobody rarely puts an early date on it. And so most scholars date it to 80 to 90 or 90 to 110. So when your friend looks at Wikipedia, it's going to tell them it wasn't written by Luke. And since it wasn't written by Luke, it's not early. I'm going to be presenting evidence that it was written by Luke. And I believe it was written early. But before we go ahead, let's just note that little contradiction he claimed. And here's what he's getting at. In the book of Acts, it says, when Paul came to Jerusalem, he went in and out among them at Jerusalem, preaching boldly. It says that's in the book of Acts, but when you read what Paul actually said, he said, I went up to Jerusalem, but I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. So he's saying there's a contradiction there. And what they accept, unbelievers accept as early, they say, yeah, he was unknown down there. But they say in Acts, he's going in and out boldly. So they say contradiction, so it can't be early, can't be written by Luke. Well, let's just take a look at that for a second. There's a difference between Jerusalem and Judea. Jerusalem and Judea are not the same thing. Jerusalem is a city in Judea. And so both texts say he went to Jerusalem, but where was he unknown? In Judea. So he was there for 2 weeks, and during that 2 weeks, where was he? Going in and out at Jerusalem. But he was still unknown by face among the churches of Judea. So no contradiction. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. Authorship, making a case for Luke being the author, and I'm going to argue that it was written around 62, 63. I'm going to present evidence in favor of that. It's not an absolute. There's not a verse that says that was the year, and some of my assumptions based on the history could be over-assuming. So this is not gospel. We're talking about the gospel he wrote, but my argument on the date is not gospel. But I'll be presenting some arguments from his gospel and from the book for why I believe that's the date. All right, so Luke, there's going to be 3 things we're going to look at for saying that it's Luke. 1, the historic attribution that it's just basically always been considered to be by Luke. And then there's internal evidence in the book of Acts that supports that it's Luke. And then we're going to do a comparison between the prison voyage and the epistles. If you've ever been studying the book of Acts or trying to do a class, you might wonder, why are there so much text at the end about the shipwreck? I'm really glad it's there, and you'll see why as we go further. And that's going to help us identify the author. You'll see why as we go along. Let's start out with historic attribution. So first off, this is one of the early manuscripts that we have of Luke, and it's Papyrus 75. And right there at the end, it says the gospel kata Lukan, the gospel according to Luke. So at that time, when that papyrus was written, it was understood by people to be written by Luke. And this is dated around 175 to 225. There's some other people that set them other dates, but it's one of the earliest manuscripts that we have of the gospel. Irenaeus says Luke, a companion of the gospel, a companion of Paul, recorded in a book, the gospel. Tertullian talks about John, Matthew, first and still faith of apostolic men. Luke and Mark renew it. Clement of Alexandria quotes Luke and talks about Luke writing in the Acts of the Apostles. The dates of those quotes are 180, 208, and about 198 AD. And then the Muratorian fragment, which is, I won't take time. If later someone wants to talk about it, I'll explain why. but we've got reason to date the moratorium fragment about 170 AD, the original of it, and it says the third gospel book, that according to Luke, this physician Luke. And then it talks about in the Acts of the Apostles, written in one book, the most excellent Theophilus, Luke summarizes. So historical attribution, I've never seen it attributed to anybody else, and it's repeatedly and early attributed to Luke. That's about 170 AD. So now let's move to the internal evidence in the book of Acts. Both books are written by the same author. He doesn't give his name, but he gives the name of Theophilus. So in Luke 1, on the gospel, he talks about the things that were accomplished by those who were eyewitnesses, ministers who were delivered to us. Seemed good to me also, having followed all things, to write to you, most excellent Theophilus. Then over here, he refers back to that one. He says, in the first book, O Theophilus, I dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach till the day when he was taken up. And of course, where does Luke end? With Jesus being taken up. And then he's going to tell what happens next. So both of them are, the second one refers to the first one, and they're both directed to Theophilus, addressed to him, or some people believe kind of dedicated to him, because maybe he sponsored the book, but without getting into that, it's clearly in both of them here, the reference to Theophilus. So actually, I'm going to establish the authorship of Luke by finding evidence for Luke writing Acts. And if Luke wrote Acts and it's the same author, then that supports the historic attribution that we've already seen that it wrote Luke. Theophilus is called most excellent. This is a phrase used of a governor, another governor, and Paul when speaking to not another governor, but somebody else talking to the governor, and then Paul to the governor. When they're addressing him, they say most excellent. So like in our culture today, if you overhear somebody saying, Your Honor, I would like to make it, you know who he's talking to. He's talking to a judge. So Theophilus is a high official, whether a governor or something else, and Luke is addressing him here. I don't have time to go into detail, but if somebody would like to ask me about it later, I've got charts we won't take time to. I have a suspicion of where he was an official at, but I'm not going to take time to get into that, but you can ask me about it if you want to. Luke doesn't claim to be an eyewitness of the things in the Gospels. He said that he wrote down the things that were delivered to him from and others from the eyewitnesses. And so this is not somebody pretending. If you were going to pretend, why not say, I was there, I saw it? He doesn't do that in the Gospels. He refers to others who are the eyewitness, and he's compiled these things together. But though the author was clearly not an eyewitness to the events in his Gospel, he just as clearly was an eyewitness to some of the events in the book of Acts. In Acts, there's a definitive contrast between the we sections of Acts, where the author was eyewitness, and the he-they sections, where he was not. And most of you have probably noticed this. You're reading in Acts, and sometimes they went, and sometimes we went. I think it's very interesting. Luke doesn't make a big deal when he joins up with Paul. There's no chapter. And then Paul met Luke, the beloved physician, and was pretty impressive. It just, all he does basically, well, there's two things he does, but the most obvious is he just simply it stops being they, and suddenly it's we. And we, and then when Paul goes on and he doesn't, it's he, they. And when Paul meets up with the command, suddenly it's we again. But he doesn't make a big deal about it. But there's one huge difference in those sections. Let's take a look. On the first missionary journey, it'll be they went to Cyprus, they went up to Perga, they sailed to Antioch. Oh yeah, and then originally they went down to Seleucia. On the second missionary journey, Barnabas and John Mark went this way, Paul and Silas, they went that way, and they or he go through there, and then they go up to Troas. But when they leave Troas, we leave Troas. And we go by this island, and we go to Philippi, and we go down to the riverbank, and we meet Lydia. And then, but after Paul is released from jail, Paul and the others, they go on, but we don't. And Paul continues on, he, etc., travels onward. Then on the third missionary journey, they travel back, but suddenly in Acts 20, the others went before, and we sailed from Philippi. And we got to Troas, and then we all the way home, back to Jerusalem. And thank you for laughing. And then on the prison voyage, which is 2 years later, this tells us something about the loyalty of this man. When Paul appeals to Caesar and is put as a prisoner on the ship, we are on the ship, and all the way through to Rome. Now, you've got all those details there. Here's a trivia question. How many times did Paul suffer shipwreck? And some of you are thinking 3, because Paul said what? Thrice I suffered shipwreck. When did he write that? During the third missionary journey, when he was up in Macedonia before he went down to Corinth. The big Acts 27 shipwreck hasn't happened yet. So before this voyage, way back when he was up in Macedonia, he said he'd suffered shipwreck 3 times. Over 2 years later, he'll suffer shipwreck again. Where does Luke tell us about the other 3 shipwrecks? He doesn't. But he tells us a lot about the one when he was in the shipwreck. And this is fascinating. When you look at the sea voyages in the book of Acts, there's a magnificent difference that has the thumbprint or fingerprint of a first-hand witness. Watch. These are passages in the book of Acts that describe a sea voyage when the author wasn't with Paul. These are passages in the book of Acts when the author was with Paul. Watch the difference. They sailed to Cyprus. They came to Perga. Paul and his company came to Perga. They sailed to Antioch. They conducted him as far as Athens. They sailed to Syria. They came to Ephesus. He set sail from Ephesus, landed at Caesarea. That's it, basically. And where would he have gotten that information from? From Paul. And can you imagine Paul telling Luke about the different things that happened? Kind of knowing Paul's personality, what parts of the story do you think Paul's going to focus on? You know, the gospel, the arguments, the opposition, the people that came to Christ, et cetera, et cetera. And then we went to here. And then, you know, et cetera. So Luke writes down, they went from A to B. Watch what happens when the author is there. Setting sail from Troas, we made a straight course to Samothrace, that's a little island, the day following to Neapolis. Then that was the sea voyage to Philippi. Then, years later, Paul's on the third missionary journey, and he's coming back through, and when he comes up to the same area, Philippi, the author picks back up with Paul. We sailed away from Philippi after the days of the unleavened bread and came to Troas in 5 days. Same voyage right here. This one, it only took 2 days when they're going northwest. But when they're going the other way, it took 5 days. They didn't have steamships. You know, they were dependent on weather and things like that, and currents and such. When over here does he tell how many days a journey took? But he's there, and when he's there, he notices those details, he remembers them, and he gives them. Chapter 20, and this is after Eutychus has fallen asleep and everything, and on the piece of land there, the ship is going to go around here, and Paul's going to walk across the land. We, going before the ship, set sail for Assos, there intending to take on Paul. He had appointed, intending himself to go by land. When we met him at Assos, we took him in, came to Mytilene. Sailing from thence, we came the following day over against Chios. The next day we touched at Samos. The day after we came to Miletus. Paul determined to sail past Ephesus that he might not have to spend time in Asia. He's trying to get to Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost. Chapter 20. They brought him on his way to the ship. When it came to pass that we were parted to sail, we sailed with a straight course to Kos, the next day under Rhodes, and from thence to Patara. Having found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. You see, when we travel, if you catch a flight from, say, Huntsville to Atlanta, and then Atlanta to Philadelphia, and then Philadelphia to London or whatever, you've got it all planned out ahead of time. That's not how it worked. You would go so far with one ship, and then you got to the port, and you found another ship going the direction you want to go. And so finding a ship crossing over Phoenicia, hey, that's getting us close to Jerusalem. We went aboard and set sail. When we would come in sight of Cyprus, leaving it on the left, we sailed to Tyre, for there the ship was unladen her burden. Chapter 21, they all with wives and children brought us on our way. Kneeling down on the beach, we prayed and bid each other farewell. We went on board the ship, but they returned home. When we finished the voyage from Tyre, we arrived at Ptolemais. And then you got chapter 27. I'm not going to read all of this, but I'll read a few of the details. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Embarking in a ship of the Adramyttium, which was about to set sail to ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus. Next day we put in at Sidon. Julius treated Paul kindly, gave him leave to go to his friends. Putting out from the sea, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we'd sailed across open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. There, a centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days. With difficulty arrived to Cnidus. The wind wouldn't allow us to go further. We sailed under the lee of Crete off Salomone. Coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Laodicea. Since much time had passed, et cetera, and this is where Paul warns them, but they still try to make it. And then, when the south wind blew gently, supposing they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor, sailed along close to the shore. Soon a tempestuous wind called a northeaster struck down. The ship was caught and couldn't face the wind. We gave way and were driven along. Running under a lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. That would be the extra one. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis, which was some kind of like sandbars under the sea at a different point. They lowered all the gear and they were driven along. Violently storm-tossed, they started throwing out the cargo. Then they started throwing out the ship's tackle. When neither sun or stars appeared for many days, etc., all hope was being abandoned. And then Paul starts telling them they're going to be okay. And that he says, an angel of the Lord said, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and God has granted all those that sail with you. But you're going to be cast on a certain island." Luke's there with Paul when he makes that prophecy. And then that happens. They start sounding. They realize they're getting closer and closer to land. But then, fearing they might run aground on the rocks, they let down the anchors, prayed for day to come. And the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, lowered the ship's boat down into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors. Paul said, no, unless these men stay in the ship, you can't be saved. So and now the centurion's starting to listen to Paul. Paul was right before. And then he tells him to eat. I'm not going to take time to read all this, but every one of those men made it to shore. The ship gets stuck, and it's about to be breaking up and stuff, and 276 people in some manuscripts, and it talks about as the ship is breaking up and different things, striking a reef, the vessel were on the ground, the stern was being broken up, and the soldiers wanting to kill the prisoners lest they escape, and the centurion wanting to spare Paul says no. They all made it there, even though some of them couldn't swim. That's pretty remarkable. There's no Coast Guard there. They don't have modern life preservers, but the ones that couldn't swim, God had said, I'm giving you all these men. And as the ship is breaking up in these stormy seas, they all make it to the island. And then he describes the events on the island with the snake bite and stuff. And then finally, after they got on a ship with the twin gods as a figurehead on the front, and he talks about getting there. Do you see that the author was with Paul? He was there. And, somebody might say, well, he's pretending he was there. If I was going to pretend, I would have made a bigger deal about myself. He says, we. Now I say, but there's a big difference here. How many of you had noticed this difference before? Probably most of you had not noticed this difference before. You see, when somebody's trying to pull a fraud and fake something, it's right in your face. They're like, they want to make sure you see it. This is not right in your face, but when you think about it, it's unmistakably there. The man that wrote this was with Paul, and this is how we can start identifying it as Luke. He was with Paul on the prison voyage and got to the city of Rome with him. You see it right there? And then they come to Betulia, and then we found brothers, and then we came to Rome. And then the book ends with Paul has well, that's not quite the end of the book. We're coming up on the end of the book. So whoever wrote this book was with Paul for these events. And he was with Paul when he came to Rome. He was with Paul when he went to Jerusalem. And after 2 years of prison, he's with Paul all the way through that voyage, and he gets into the city with Paul. So now our question is, who was in Rome with Paul? And we're going to do some process of elimination. Everybody understand the concept? 2 years after traveling with Paul from Philippi to Jerusalem, our author now travels from Caesarea to Rome, and we establish 2 points. He's a close associate of Paul, and he comes with Paul to Rome, which leads to that question, who was with Paul in Rome? How can we find out who was with Paul in Rome? In the prison epistles, what does Paul usually do at the end? He mentions who's with him. So that's where our author is going to be. We're going to find his name in the prison epistles when he mentions who's there with him. Does that make sense? Problem is, he mentions a lot of people that were with him. So now we're going to do some process of elimination. When he writes letters from prison, greetings from, and here's Ephesus, or we got Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, and then later 2 Timothy. But we're not going to focus on that because that's not the time period where we see the author come. That's years later, so we're not going to worry much about that. But on these first ones, let's start looking who was there. Well, from Ephesians, we know Tychicus was with him in Rome. From Philippians, we know Timothy and Epaphroditus were there. From Colossians, we know Tychicus, Onesimus, Aristarchus, Mark, Justus, Epaphras, and Luke and Demas were there, and Timothy. From Philemon, we know Timothy and Onesimus and Epaphras and Mark and Aristarchus and Demas and Luke were there. And then 2 Timothy, sometime later, you have these people mentioned. But again, that's not the time period that we're looking at where our author came on the ship voyage, so we won't spend much time on those guys. Now, we're going to put these guys in 3 categories. Some of them, the evidence is going to eliminate it. No, that couldn't have been him. Some of them, it won't eliminate it, but it will lean against it. And then we'll see who the evidence points to. So we're going to start off with 2 Timothy 4, where it mentions Demas. Demas, it mentions in 2 Timothy 4, which is the later one, he says, Demas forsook me. But we know from one of the earlier epistles that Demas had been there. Is it possible that Demas was with him originally, wrote the book of Luke Acts, and then abandoned him? Maybe. But does the loyalty that you see in the book of Acts look like a guy that's going to abandon Paul? No. So I'm going to put that in the category evidence leans against. Then we have Epaphroditus. We know that he was in Rome with Paul. And by the way, all these charts will be available to anybody who wants them. Epaphroditus is in Rome with Paul, but how did Epaphroditus get to Rome? After Paul was already a prisoner in Rome, the Philippians sent him from Philippi with money. So is that the guy on the prison voyage? No. So that's not him. All right? How about Onesimus? We know from Philemon that Onesimus was with Paul in Rome, in fact, converted there. So was he the guy that had been with Paul for years? No, that's not him. That eliminates him. And then we have Epaphras. Epaphras was a gospel preacher who, minister of the gospel, who had taught the Colossians. Maybe, but he seems to be down here in the area of Colossae, and then later in Rome, whereas our author, we've seen him at Troas and Philippi again. So a little bit different areas. I would say the evidence doesn't point to him. And then Acts 15 mentions Mark did what? He went on the first missionary journey and then went home. But before he went home, was it we or they? They. They went to Seleucia, they went to Cyprus, and then John Mark went home. It wasn't we went to Seleucia, we went to Cyprus, and then I went home. So it's not John Mark. And then we have Justus. This one is not absolute. Some people believe that the author of Luke Acts is a Gentile because in Luke 4 it talks about their synagogues and their language. John, a Jew, will speak about the Jews, so it could be that he's speaking third hand even though he's a Jew, but it's generally thought that the author is not a Jew, he's a Gentile. If that's so, then it's not Justus, because we know from Colossians 4 he was a Jew. So we'll put that in evidence points against. Well, we still got Tychicus, Aristarchus, Timothy, and all these guys. Turn with me to Acts chapter 20. This is really cool because we're going to get rid of a bunch of guys all at once. This is the third missionary journey. If you remember when he went to Corinth and would have written the book of Romans, he's there 3 months, and he was going to sail from Corinth back with the money, but he realized there was a plot against him. You remember that? And so he decides to go up by land. There's men from the different churches going back with him with the funds that he's taken back, and it mentions his traveling companions. So, verse 3, he spent 3 months there down in Greece. When a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail, he decided to return to Macedonia. Sopater, the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him. Of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe and Timothy, and of the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. Now, one of you brethren read verse 5 and 6 and emphasize the we and the they, if you see it.
These men going ahead waited for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days.
These guys went on ahead, and then we came afterwards. So all that list of guys is not our guy. And included in that list were all of them. Look who's left. Luke. Luke is left. And later in 2 Timothy, what does Paul call him? Luke, the beloved physician. Not Demas forsook me, Luke, the beloved physician. And, 2 Timothy is where he says, only Luke is with me. And in Colossians is where he says, Luke, the beloved physician. 3 times in Paul's prison writings, he mentions Luke. So, you put that together with all his early historical testimony that said that it was Luke. Obviously, our author was there. He was an eyewitness on that shipwreck. He was there. He was in that storm. He was, he was there. So this isn't written by somebody later making up a legend. He was there. And all the early testimony says it was Luke, and our process of elimination points right to Luke. So, I believe the book of Acts was written by Luke. And if Acts was written by Luke, and it's the second volume of a 2-volume work, then who wrote Luke? Same as it has in the heading of your Bible, the Gospel of Luke. Side notes and authorities, we're not going to take time to read this, except I'll just mention it briefly. Some people made a big argument about the medical language in Luke. I don't think that's convincing. There was an argument back in the 1800s by Hobart. It was pretty well rebutted in scholars' view by Cadbury in 1926. Some of the language could have been by a doctor, but not necessarily by a doctor. I don't think that's a convincing argument. Sir William Mitchell Ramsay, a very interesting fellow who started off with the belief taught by the liberal school of thought in Germany that this was something written in the 2nd century and not by Luke. And as he started doing his research down in Turkey and Asia Minor, he started being more and more and more impressed with the historicity of it. And he ends up saying things like talking about trustworthiness, and he says he gives 4 classes of trustworthiness of ancient historians, and he says great historians are the rarest, and he puts the author of Acts in historians of first rank. If you want to read these notes, these will be available, and you can, he talks about it, gradually born on me, the via its details showed marvelous truth. If you want to read more about that, you can. Now let's start looking at date. When was it written? Well, we have 2 key anchor dates in Acts. I'm not going to have time to explain both of these in detail. If you want to ask me later, you can. But we got 2 dates. One is Paul got to Corinth in 50 AD, give or take a few months. And Paul appealed to Caesar about 59 AD. Those are our 2 anchor dates that we can estimate the other things from. The reason we can do the first one is because, you remember, while Paul was there, you had an official come in, and the Jews grabbed Paul and take him before him. And that was when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. Gallio, by the way, was the brother of Seneca, if you're familiar with him. But Paul stayed there a year and a half, but when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews brought him before the tribunal. So he didn't seem to be there when Paul first got there, but he is later. And from this historical inscription, we know that Gallio got there in 51. If Gallio got there in 51 and Paul was there for a year and a half, that pretty much puts Paul got there in 50, give or take a few months. All right? So Paul's arrival at Corinth was 50. And then how do we know when he appeals to Caesar? When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. Desiring the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. And then very quickly after that, Paul appeals to him and the king and different things, and he does the appeal. From coinage, the Felix coins were minted in the year of Nero 3, which would be 56 to 57. But the Festus coins were minted in the year of Nero 5, which would be 58, 59. And so scholars place the date there right at about 59, give or take just a little bit. So those are our 2 anchor dates that don't have much wiggle room. 50, give or take a little bit, is when Paul got to Corinth. 59, give or take a little bit, is when he appealed to this, when he appears for Festus and Agrippa. Then we have the prison voyage. And then Luke says he lived there 2 whole years. So 59 plus the prison voyage where he tried to get them to winter there, and then after the winter they finally get, after the months they finally get up there, and then he spends there 2 whole years. That's why that brings us up to 62, 63. So here's why I'm going to argue it's this date. 1, our author is contemporary with Paul. We see him with Paul back in the year 49, and we see him with Paul in the year 60. Secondly, the terminus point of the text. Where does the book end? It ends about 62 AD with Paul still a prisoner. Why stop there? Why end a book with, and Paul was there 2 years? There's more stuff that happens. Why end it there? I could be wrong about what I'm assuming here, so I'll present what I think, but I could be wrong about this, but here's what I suspect. I suspect the reasons for dating it in the early 60s is because the ending of the book of Acts. Think about it. Luke, which covers 34 years, and Acts, which covers 32 years, where does Luke begin? The birth of John the Baptist, right? Is that a random date or a pretty significant date? In God's plan, that was kind of a big deal, right? The birth of John the Baptist and then the birth of Jesus, that's a good place to begin. Where does the book of Luke end? Crucifixion, resurrection, ascension. Does that make a pretty good ending point? Yeah. Where does the book of Acts begin? With the ascension. Where does it end? And he's there for 2 years. Why end there? Here's what I'm suggesting. The Gospel of Luke is composed up to a culminating event, the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension. But sometimes a book ends because that's where you're at when you write it. This is a pictorial history of American presidents. Anybody want to guess what year that book was written? Late 70s. How do you know? Because it gives a history from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and yada, 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 down to Richard Nixon, down to Gerald Ford. Why didn't it have Jimmy Carter? Because Jimmy Carter hadn't been president yet when that book was written. Or Ronald Reagan, or et cetera, et cetera. I suspect that's, the book ends there because Paul's death hasn't happened yet. One of the major events of the book of Acts is persecution. Stop and think about it. It's one of the major themes. If Paul's already been killed, why not have that in there? But we end right there. I'm suggesting it's because that's when he writes it, which is why I suspect the date would be 62, 63. Also, the persecution status at the time of writing. This is kind of interesting. Up to this point, Paul's imprisonment there, where has most of the persecution come from in the book of Acts? The Jews. Starting in 64 AD, where is a lot of persecution going to start coming from? The Romans. Now you say, well, he's in prison of the Romans right now. Yes, but who put him there? The Jews. The Jews had made an accusation that he'd gone in the temple with the Gentile and everything. At the time this was written, relative persecution, what were the relations between the early church and the Jewish leaders? Really hostile, really hostile. What was the relations between the early church and Roman leaders? Not hostile, particularly. Have you ever thought about this? It's really interesting. Look at centurions in Luke Acts. How many centurions do you think are mentioned in Luke Acts? Just think for a minute, guess in your mind. How many centurions? I'm going to guess you're estimating low. Here's the centurions in Luke Acts. He mentions the one who built the synagogue for the Jews, and Jesus said, I haven't seen faith like that in all of Israel. That's also mentioned like in Matthew, Mark, except the built the synagogue part. Only in Luke does it say the centurion said, certainly this man was innocent. Acts 10, Cornelius, a devout, generous, well-respected man. Romans 21, who helped rescue Paul from the mob? Centurions. Acts 22, when they were about to beat him, who respected that Paul was a Roman citizen and stopped? A centurion. Who took Paul's nephew and reported him to the tribune. Paul said to the centurion, come here, take this young man, to report to the tribune. And who does that for Paul? A centurion. Who takes Paul safely to Caesarea when the 40 men were going to kill him? Centurions. And on the prison voyage, who at Caesarea gave Paul liberty and wanted to let him go see his friends? Centurions. And who, when other people wanted to kill the prisoners, protected Paul? Centurions. My point is this: in the book of Luke Acts, the centurions are kind of like police officers in a town. They're guys you can kind of count on for law and order. It doesn't mean they always behave themselves. One of them, one of the governors, for example, is waiting for a bribe. It doesn't mean these men were always good. But usually in this area, can you usually count on the sheriff for law and order? Or the police for law and order? There might be some bad ones, but usually you can count on them. In Luke Acts, the Romans are not the bad guys. And of course, to escape the threat of the Jews, Paul appeals to Caesar. That changes in 64 AD. Rome burns, things turn vicious. Tacitus talked about when the city burned, people blamed him, and rumors went out everywhere that this was there was his fault, etc. Finally, the fire was put out, and all human efforts and lavish gifts of the emperor and propitiation gods didn't banish the sinister belief that the fire was a result of an order. To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. That's Tacitus, writing in early 2nd century. He was a senator and Roman historian. And he didn't like Christians, but he knew what Nero was doing here to blame this on them. That's 64 AD in Rome. Christians were burned alive in Rome. 64 AD. When was Romans written? During that 3-minute period in Greece, about 57 AD, give or take. Just 7 years earlier, you know that in Romans 16, that long list of Christians that Paul gives greeting to, Aquila, Priscilla, Mary, Narcissus, all those people, those were Christians in Rome just 7 years earlier. Probably some of the people in that list in Romans 16 were some of the ones that got burned alive in Caesar's garden. High chance of that. If you'd written Luke Acts after 64 AD, would you have selected, there's good centurions and bad centurions, but would you have would you have the same focus on the Romans who at that time were pretty reliable? It's kind of like what Paul said back in Romans 13. You can usually rely on the government to be the ones that punish evildoers. In 1 Peter, it says, do what you should, and probably you won't be persecuted, but even if you are, still do what you should do anyway. But obey the governor, obey the king, etc. But the nature of the book in Luke Acts, the Jews are the bad guys still. Soon there's going to be a new set of bad guys. It doesn't make sense to me that Luke would be written as it's written at a different time period. It seems to be written at the time period when the most hostile persecutions were still coming primarily just from the Jews. There's the quotes about burning them alive. I'm not going to take to read that. So, supporting a date for Luke in the early century, the status of persecution is seen in Acts as almost always instigated from Jewish opponents. Occasionally, some of the pagans join in too, or even start it. But usually the Jews get it started. Other than occasional breach of rights, Acts 16, where they beat Paul without, when they shouldn't have, or the desire for a bribe, Acts 24, the Romans in Acts are generally a source of stability, law and order, and relative security. So, it was written by somebody that was with Paul in 49 and was with Paul in 60. The book ends about 62 AD, and the persecution status at that time was Jewish hostility and Roman stability. And that will shift later. It appears to be prior to Nero's persecution in Rome, so that's why I would date it around 62 or 63. And that's Acts. And in the beginning of Acts, he said the previous thing, so we know Luke was written before that. So, that's why I believe we can present a historical argument. Who wrote the book of Luke? Luke. Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. When was it written? Not 90, not 80. I believe it was written right around 62, 63. And we'll close with this reading from Luke 1, 1 through 4. And thanks for bearing with me. And like I said, I'm going to make tomorrow short and simple because y'all deserve a break. But I appreciate you sticking with me through this. Luke chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many of us undertaken to compile a narrative of things which have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things which you have been taught. And if you need to respond to Luke's Lord and our Lord and the Lord of us all, won't you do that as we stand?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.